Well, from a very young age, Agnes understood the cruelty of poverty. She was only 8 years old when her father died. He owned a construction company, and he had this mysterious death. In fact, he was poisoned, most likely by his business partner, who ended up taking away all the assets of the company and leaving Agnes, her mother, and her older siblings with nothing. She had 2 older siblings, a sister and a brother. But that descent into poverty didn't seem to matter to Agnes's mother, who became a seamstress to pay the bills, but more importantly for her kids, never seemed to let their poverty affect who she was and where she spent her time. Every waking hour that she had was given to others to help them, both her kids and other people on the street who she would always say are more in need than her own family. And it was always others directed her whole life, and that had a huge impact on Agnes. She saw that while poverty could take away the material things, it never really took away the things that she valued the most. Things like love and family and friendship and laughter and joy. Despite her situation growing up, which was horrible, she looked back on her childhood later as a happy childhood. And a big part of that happiness was her church life. Her family attended church daily, and she just never wanted to be anywhere else. She witnessed firsthand the power of faith in people's life. She witnessed firsthand the power of prayer in people's life and how God answered prayer. And she loved music. She used to sing in the choir, and she played the mandolin, and it was the greatest thing, and she laughed all the time. In fact, she organized the youth group activities. She organized all the parties, and she was the proverbial life of the party. She laughed frequently and easily, and people loved to be around her. Maybe that's why it wasn't a big surprise when at the age of 12, Agnes said adamantly that she wanted to be in full-time ministry at the age of 12. She wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to combine the love and the care that she saw her mother showing to other people with the message of the church, a message of hope and redemption. And isn't that what Jesus is all about anyway? What did Jesus say? He said, love the Lord God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Combining those two, and that's what Agnes wanted to do. So she asked one of her church leaders at 12 years old. She said, how can I be certain that God is calling me to be a missionary? And he saw her sincerity, and he saw her enthusiasm. And he said, this is how, your joy. If the joy you have for that calling remains, then that's a factor. Then you'll know. He said, joy is always the proof of the rightness of any endeavor. And as she grew older, that joy didn't leave. So even though Agnes was happy at home and loved her family and wasn't aching to leave them, when she was 18, she applied and was accepted at a missionary training center in, of all places, Ireland. Once there, she was immediately immersed into a 6-week intensive training program on a foreign language. She learned a foreign language. That foreign language was English. She would pick up 2 more languages along the way, but on December 1st, 1928, she boarded a ship sailing to a country where she would spend the rest of her life, where her only goal was to help the poor while living among them. What she never expected and never fully embraced was that her work helping others would be recognized around the world and be honored with a Nobel Prize and an audience with presidents and prime ministers and, yes, even the Pope. And that was important to her because, yes, her church was a Catholic church, and her church leader back home was her priest, and the training center that she went to in Ireland was a convent. And when Agnes finally took her vows, pledging herself to a life of chastity and poverty and obedience, she became a nun. And as is the custom with nuns, they take on a saintly name. And she took on another name, a name that the world would come to know her by, Teresa. We know her as Mother Teresa. We're in a series called Heroes, looking at some amazing men and women, people of faith, who use that faith and their reliance on God to do some incredible things. And we've had a good time looking at a lot of people, haven't we? We've looked at the life of George Whitefield and George Washington and Martin Luther King and Christopher Columbus and Paul Revere and Joan of Arc and Noah Webster and Davy Crockett and Abraham Lincoln and Corrie ten Boom and the infamous Albert McMakin, who we talked about last week. And I hope you invited some friends this week in honor of Albert. And we matched some of those people's lives against some biblical figures, such as Bartimaeus and the Apostle Paul and the first disciple ever called, Simon Peter's brother, Andrew. And I hope that as we've gone through this series, you've been able to get a sense of the legacy of faith that has been brought down to you. Because you've got an incredible legacy of faith to stand on. You have solid roots as a Christian that people throughout the years have handed it down. And it's hard to find a better example than Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was born Ganya Agnes, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name. That's her name. She was born in 1910 in Skopje, the capital city of what is now the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. I'm not sure why anybody would name their country that, but it's still called that today. Most people call it New Macedonia. And you see, it's just north of Greece, and it's just west of Bulgaria and Turkey. And when Agnes was born, it was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And if you don't know your history at all, the Ottoman Empire lasted for years and years and years. It was a Turkish empire and a Muslim ruling class, although they allowed on a limited basis certain other religions to exist. And in the town, Skopje, where Mother Teresa grew up, it was about a little over 90% Muslim and a little under 10% Catholic. And her priest growing up, who stayed a dear friend and mentor to her whole life, his name was Father Jembrakovic. And it was his influence in her life that sent her to India, specifically Calcutta. And he expressed a great deal of enthusiasm for the work that the Catholic missionaries were already there doing. In fact, invited them back to Skopje to their church, and they told of the great need in Calcutta. And Mother Teresa, or at that time Agnes, was enthralled with it, was inspired by it, and was influenced by those missionaries. And when Mother Teresa first arrived in India, she realized right away that she had no idea what true poverty was. Yeah, she grew up in poverty, there's no doubt about it, but when she got to India, it was another level. She described the situation like this: many families live in the streets along the city walls. There are people everywhere, sick, unfed, wearing at best a ragged loincloth. As we went along the street, we chanced upon one family gathered around a dead relation, wrapped in worn red rags. It was a horrifying scene. If our people could only see all this, they would stop grumbling about their own misfortunes and offer thanks to God for blessing them with such abundance. That's a powerful statement coming from somebody that grew up in complete poverty. What's frightening to me is that the situation in India, it's virtually remained unchanged for 90 years. If you guys know, Compass has sent many ministry teams and short-term mission teams to India. You see myself and Kyle and Kalisha there in the back, Kyle and Kalisha Fleischman, who are now in ministry, full-time ministry themselves in Arizona. But they started out here at Compass and got a taste for ministry, and then they went into full-time ministry, and that was really cool. And this is part of what they did. It was their very first time going on a mission trip. And now Kyle leads mission trips every year for his church down in Arizona. But we were welcomed greatly when we got to India. But the poverty there is almost undescribable. It's really hard to take it in a setting like this and see what was certainly overwhelming to me when I first got there. Thousands and thousands of people live under the freeways there. You stand under the freeway and you see all these people, and you look at the freeway that goes for miles and miles and miles, and you see nothing but people just living under the freeways. Makeshift houses and communities are put up in every single vacant lot. And outdoor laundries are everywhere, where it seems to me the clothes come out dirtier after they're washed. And that's India today. But while Mother Teresa was distressed about the poverty, she found herself experiencing great joy in caring for these people. Mixing with the poor reinforced what she had learned many years earlier in home, that one could be deeply happy despite the lack of material possessions. And we found the same thing when we were there. You look here, this is another guy who became a Christian at Compass. I love showing pictures of people that became Christians at Compass and then went on their first mission trip or did something serving and found a great, what God had created them to do. And Mark lives in Eugene now. But he became a Christian at Compass, went on his first mission trip, and he was enthralled. And now he goes every single year somewhere. And he came to India with us and saw that, you know what, despite they live in squalor, they were the happiest kids he'd ever seen. And they loved greeting us. And they're extremely joyful and colorful people. They're laughing and they're smiling all the time. You see that idiot sitting in the middle of just wonderful, wonderful girls. And they're grateful people. Grateful for even the smallest blessing of food or being talked to. As these two as we met them on the street, we talked to them, and they're just so thrilled to be talked to. Or maybe they got a somewhat used sweater to put in their little suitcase that carried every single possession in their life. And they slept on floors that were cement with no mattress or anything. That's what's going on in India today, and it just really hasn't changed. Yet the horrible conditions they live in brought circumstances, difficult circumstances all the time, especially in Mother Teresa's time, and especially with Mother Teresa's tiny frame, weak lungs, and her chronic cough. Her superiors in the Catholic order didn't want her to stay in India. They thought, this is too much for you. I know you wanted to go here. We left you here for a while, but we want to bring you out. And she just said, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. Even during World War II. In World War II, the Japanese went all the way to Burma, which is near India, and they're sitting in Burma, so there was a lot of danger there. During World War II, there was a devastation of a famine that affected all India and flooded the convent with orphans. And Mother Teresa said, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. These people need me. They're great people. And she established a mission center that she called the Missionaries of Charity. And they provided food, and they provided medical care, and they visited the elderly, and they gave comfort to the abandoned, and they taught children how to read, and they taught children good hygiene. Their entire mission was based on Matthew chapter 25, which says this. This is Jesus talking. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then his disciples said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And Jesus' words in verse 40 were on the lips and the mind of every single person that worked at the Missionaries of Charity. Verse 40 says this, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Let's say that verse together. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And you heard that come out of Mother Teresa's mouth constantly. And she saw Jesus in every man, woman, and child. Every time. The malnourished child, the woman in the gutter, the filthy man covered with sores. She called them this, Jesus in his distressing disguise. Love that. She felt that the biggest problem on earth was being unloved. Would you agree with that? I would. So she set out with this simple mission to show people love, no matter what situation they were in. But it wasn't on her own power. There were times when even Mother Teresa was discouraged, and she wrote about it. There were times when even Mother Teresa came on to somebody who was tough to love, and she wrote about it. But she loved him anyway, through the strength that God gave her. You see, the one thing that distinguished Mother Teresa more than anything else was her complete, 100% reliance on God. With her, it wasn't just a platitude or a religious principle. It was an everyday reality. She said this, real sacrifice must cost, must hurt, and must empty us. Give yourselves fully to God. He will use you to accomplish great things on the condition that you believe much more in His love than in your weakness. This lady knows how to speak, doesn't she? She doesn't have like a group of writers for her. I love this stuff. He will use you, God will use you to accomplish great things on the condition that you believe much more in His love than in your weakness. And she fully depended on God for everything, including miracles. And there were plenty of them where Mother Teresa was around. One day, Mother Teresa and her helpers, they ran out of food. And later that day, a knock came at the door, and there was this woman standing at the door. She had bags of rice with her. And all she could say is, inexplicably, she said, I just felt like I needed to come here today and bring you this rice. And they said, thank you. We just ran out of food. Another time, as the sisters were making a mattress for a new arrival, they ran out of cotton cloth to make the mattress. Another knock at the door later that night. And there was this British man who had a mattress in his hand. And he said, I'm moving back to England, but I just thought that you guys might need a mattress. Simple things like that. Other times, bigger things. On another occasion, when a horrible virus was making its way through the region, the sisters were besieged with over 7,000 patients. And they didn't have enough food to feed that many the first few days. They had called the Catholic diocese to get the food, but it wasn't going to arrive for a few days. Yet in a completely unconnected coincidence, the government of Calcutta decided to shut down the local schools for a few days to do repairs. And they had all this food that they usually fed the kids with. And they decided, what are we going to do with this food? It might spoil. Let's give it to the missionaries of charity. And they came by to Mother Teresa and said, here's some food. Do you need this food? We do. And it was in these ways that God assured the sisters that He was with them in their work. And each such miracle gave them tremendous encouragement. And they needed it. They needed it. Because many of the babies brought to them had been literally dumped in garbage cans or in the drains of the gutters. And they'd wrap up each child in a blanket. And Mother Teresa would either take the child herself or give it to one of the helpers. And she'd always tell them, keep with that child, wrap it in the blanket, and love that child. Even if that child's going to die, I want you to love that child. I want no child to die being unloved. So we're going to do that. And many came in, and many died in their arms. But the good news is that many of the children brought to Mother Teresa and the other sisters were saved, and they regained their health. And as they regained their health, Mother Teresa taught them skills such as carpentry and typing and needlework so that they can get a job instead of begging in the streets. And some of the children were sent to schools, both in India and other countries. And their travel and their school fees were paid by donors who couldn't say no to Mother Teresa. And I think that's one of the best things about her. If you know any history of Mother Teresa, she didn't mind asking. And no one could say no to Mother Teresa. And she asked and asked. It was one of her most endearing qualities. She had no problem asking strangers for anything. In fact, she was very famous for getting strangers on the street. She'd just go pull somebody and say, hey, I need you to carry this. Hey, I need you to hold this child. Hey, I need you to come in here and help me. Hey, I need this money. Hey, I need this food. And they couldn't say no to Mother Teresa. And she would ask. She just knew she had strength and confidence in what she was doing. And she would go to local pharmacies and ask a question that she became famous for. Love this question. Would you like to do something beautiful for God? Would you like to do something beautiful for God? I love that. I'm going to start using that phrase. I'm going to steal that one. That's just good because it's true. When you do something for the least of these, you're doing something beautiful for God. In fact, the documentary that was made by an Englishman of Mother Teresa is entitled Something Beautiful for God. In fact, It was the British, the BBC network, that first introduced Mother Teresa to the world, although they almost took a pass. She was interviewed by a reporter there, and her answers were so simple and short that the network was going, I'm not even sure we should air this. I'm not even sure this is that good. Here's this tiny woman. She's not really expounding on things. She's just giving little, simple, short answers. But they relented, and they said, we'll just put it on a late-night slot. So they gave it a late-night slot, and they aired the program. The response in terms of the mail received by the network and the donations to the ministry is the largest in the history of the BBC, which has been around a long time. Donations of food and money started pouring in. And the popularity of this little woman skyrocketed after that one short interview. Probably the only people that she wasn't real popular with were her own hospital administrators back home in Calcutta. They grew frustrated when every time they saw this little nun carrying, she'd be like pulling a rickshaw with somebody in it that was obviously dying. Or she would be pushing a wheelchair with somebody in it who was obviously dying. And those somebodies were people that the hospital had already turned away because they didn't want to take the time to heal them because they knew they'd be dying. And Mother Teresa would say, we cannot let a child of God die in the gutter like an animal. And nobody could say no to Mother Teresa. Eventually, she asked the city of Calcutta for a building for the sick and dying. And the city was aware of her extraordinary work, and nobody could say no to Mother Teresa. So the city of Calcutta gave her a building. And the building that they gave her was next door to a Hindu temple. And the sisters would take in the sick and dying Hindus and treat their wounds and love them and allow them a clean place to die. And not surprisingly, the more radical Hindus were not pleased with that. And they wanted her out of there. And so there were violent protests erupted. And one day a Hindu leader gathered a mob of young people, and they had stones in their hands, and they came outside the building where Mother Teresa had been given by the city of Calcutta, and where these people, these just poor people, were coming to die or to get better. And the mob out there was ready to stone them and get them out of there because they didn't want them even close to their Hindu temple, these Catholics, these Christians. And Mother Teresa heard them outside. And she came out the front door and calmly approached the mob. And immediately she learned who the leader was, and she went up to the leader and she said, you know what, could you come in with me? I want to show you what we're doing here. And the leader said, okay. And he came in with her. And he stayed for a while. And he walked out. And the mob that was there asked him, hey, can we begin stoning the place now? And the mob leader said this, yes, you can, when your mothers and your sisters treat people like those mothers and those sisters. That's when you can start stoning the place. And they left. By 1965, people beyond India began asking the missionaries of charity to come to them. And Mother Teresa was only too happy to respond. And so she went, and she started opening facilities all over the world, in places no one really could have imagined before that. She was in Tanzania and Australia and Peru and London and New York and Rome. And those sound good. Oh, yeah, those are easy. Those are Western, mostly Western countries. We can do that. But she started going to Muslim and communist countries, countries like Yemen and Venezuela and Russia. You can now see facilities owned by the missionaries of charity. As the years passed, Mother Teresa received recognition and awards, which she always accepted humbly on behalf of the people she served. Famous people in sports and movies and business and government went to see her in her ministry, including presidents. Here's President Reagan. Probably her most famous and frequent visitor was a lady named Princess Di, who came with her often. And Mother Teresa treated the famous people just like she treated the poor people, with grace and humility and compassion and warmth. And she always reminded them that taking care of the poor was nothing extraordinary. It wasn't heroic. It was something we all must do. In 1979, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which she accepted in person. And in typical fashion, she did something that was extraordinary. In typical fashion, she did something that normally people wouldn't do at a secular awards ceremony like that. She proclaimed her faith in Jesus Christ to the gathering of well-dressed guests. She said this: Jesus died on the cross to show a greater love. He died for you and me, and for the leper, and the man dying of hunger, and the naked person lying in the street. We were created for this greater love. We were created for greater things than power and riches and pleasure. If you've ever seen the Nobel Peace Prize dinner where they speak, that had to stop everybody with their gold forks and their dinner and just drop them. And that's another reason I love Mother Teresa so much. She spoke truth to power all the time. Never stopped her. She spoke truth to power in a bold way. And she saw in the powerful and wealthy nations of the West another kind of poverty. She called it spiritual poverty. She said, yeah, you guys have everything, but you're not without poverty. And she wasn't shy about saying that. During a visit to London, she said this: here you have the welfare state. Nobody need starve. But there is a different poverty, the poverty of the spirit, of loneliness, and being unwanted. And she spoke about elderly people being pushed into nursing homes and nobody visiting them. And she spoke about parents who had children who they never contacted, who they never gave attention to. And then she spoke about her greatest sadness. And she took specific aim with this. And she never spoke publicly without mentioning this: the violence of abortion. And her words were strong, but her words were always spoken with love and of Jesus' forgiveness. And I want you to know that, because I know several of you, I'm sure, have had abortions in your life. And you need to know what Mother Teresa would tell you, that you have Jesus' forgiveness for that. But that, and you are welcome in Jesus' church, in the Christian church. And you need to know that, because it's such a horrible feeling inside to have done something like this. But that doesn't stop us from speaking the truth about abortion. It just says, after we speak the truth, we need to know there is forgiveness, because we all sin. Every single one of us have those. And so she did. She spoke the truth. Here's what she said when she accepted the Nobel Prize to a secular audience. Today, millions of unborn children are being killed. This is in Norway, by the way, where abortion is legal. And we say nothing. Nobody speaks of the millions of little ones who have been conceived with the same life as you and I. We allow the killing. To me, the nations who have legalized abortion are the poorest of nations. And then she reminded the unsmiling audience of the humanity of the unborn child. And she turned to Luke chapter 1. And she read a story in Luke chapter 1 about when a pregnant Mary went to visit her cousin, Elizabeth, who was also pregnant. And the Bible tells us that when the pregnant Mary went into the house of the pregnant Elizabeth, the baby in Elizabeth's womb leapt with joy because of who the baby was in the presence of. Who the baby was in presence of? The other unborn baby, Jesus. And she said, these unborn babies, they have thoughts. They have feelings. And that's who we're killing. And the entire time Mother Teresa was in ministry, she worked to end abortion, and she wrote to governments and clinics and police stations and hospitals. In her own city, she posted flyers that said, if you're an expected mom and you can't afford to raise your children, give them to me. And day and night, mothers would bring their children, their newborn babies, to Mother Teresa. And she had a long list of couples who couldn't have children that were just thrilled to adopt these babies. And for every baby she took in, she got it adopted. Not one did not go to a family. That was her prayer. And when she was asked to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast in America in 1994, she could barely be seen over the microphone. She's so tiny. But she stood tall to say this. I want to play you a little bit of it.
But I feel that the greatest destroyer of peace today is abortion. Because Jesus said, if you receive a little child, you receive me. So every abortion is the denial of receiving Jesus, is the neglect of receiving Jesus.
I wanted you to see that because there were only 4 people in the entire room that weren't clapping. When she said, when you abort a child, that child is Jesus. And you're pushing away God. And 4 people, the president and his wife and the vice president and his wife at that time, who were supporters of abortion, sat on the dais. Didn't do anything. And this is not a political statement. You know, I don't make political statements because I don't believe abortion's a political issue. It has become one, but not for Christians. You either believe that God created us or you don't. If God created us, abortion is not a political issue. It's a real one. And that's why this church will always celebrate life, and I will stand up here, and whoever's up here will be celebrating life and talking about this issue. And as I'm going through Mother Teresa, I cannot not talk about this issue because every single public statement she made, she came back to this one single issue. Now, you got to understand that she went through World War II. She went through the Holocaust. Yet she described abortion as the true Holocaust of our time because it's killing millions and millions every year, and we're letting it happen. So I say that with love, but with the truth that we have got as a church to stand up for the life of the unborn and to stand up for, and you do that through adoption. You can do that through, there's many ways. But if there's one thing we learn from Mother Teresa, we know that the unborn life is just as precious as any born life. Mother Teresa fought through a lot of criticism because of her stance on abortion. She fought through a lot of criticism for a lot of different issues. And you wouldn't believe that because everybody thinks, well, Mother Teresa, she's loved by all, but she had her share of criticism. Her fame brought criticism for those who thought they knew more about helping the poor than she did. They wonder why she didn't attack the institutional structures that caused poverty. They wonder why she didn't reorganize the missionaries of charity so that it could help more people. They said that governments, with all their vast resources, could do a better job of helping the poor than a group of nuns. And to all these critics, Mother Teresa responded that God required her to do the small things with great love. That while government welfare programs exist for good intentions, she said this, Christian love is person to person. And that might seem like a simple statement, but boy, is that significant. Christian love is person to person. And that's what she did. And that's a powerful statement for us to take home today to what should be one of our heroes, Mother Teresa. And here's another response to her critics that we can learn from. She says, God has not called me to be successful. He has called me to be faithful. God has not called me, He's not called you to be successful. He's called you to be faithful. And with all Mother Teresa's popularity, her death went as unnoticed as her birth. She died less than a week after Princess Diana died. And the papers were still mourning Princess Diana. And so they gave Mother Teresa hardly any back page. She died. And you know what? It's probably the way she would have liked it. She lived for Jesus. She lived for life in everybody. She lived for love. This small lady who loved person to person changed the life of millions. And here's the thing. She changed the attitude of millions more to say, I'm for you. Everyone should be loved. No one should ever go through life unloved. Let's do something about it, person to person. Amen? As Compass Church, let's do something about it. We're a small church in the vast world. We can do something about it, person to person. Let's just do what we can instead of going, oh, gee, how can we get this? That's what she taught us. Christian love is person to person. Let's pray.